All right, hello everybody. This video is about the ban list that just came out. So for those of you who don't know or maybe don't keep up with Standard a ton, just this last weekend, a new Standard ban list came out. I'm going to talk about it, what I think about it, and sort of a little bit about what I think about the state of Netrunner right now. Hopefully you find this a little interesting. I've been trying to make a deck building thing that was sort of about this topic of what does Standard look like. And I'll talk about the main deck I was going to talk about, but literally the entire meta just got thrown out the window. So I'm going to, in this video, talk about what cards got banned, why they got banned, in particular what decks got them banned, and just some very quick ideas on what I think might be really good. And then hopefully in my next couple of videos, we'll be exploring some of that. So hopefully you enjoy and tune in. So without any further ado, this is the article written by Sophie Crofi Harper. This came out on the 24th. There are 4 cards being added to the ban list. The first is Cabanessa Wu, then we have Endurance, then Nanisivik Grid, and then Drago Ivanov. So 2 runner cards, 2 corp cards, 3 cards from the Borealis cycle, and 1 card from FFG. So this is a pretty significant change to Standard. I would say a lot of these, Endurance was in basically every game. Drago ended up being in basically every game of several large events in a row. Cabanessa Wu we had not seen a lot of, but I think there's going to be, it is pretty clear why she gets banned. And Nanisivik Grid is maybe the one that people are less familiar with. This deck really didn't get seen a lot, but I think some action was taken against it for reasons that I think make a lot of sense. So I will say I disagree with some of the conclusions that SBT came to. I think I have some philosophical differences about how I'd like to see the game done, but I think this article is a fantastic article. It is well written and well reasoned, and I think you should do yourself a favor and actually read the whole thing. Let's start with what was considered to be the best corp deck of the meta. Maybe not this exact list, but something effectively like this list. This is the list that got Drago banned. The idea behind this list was that you would install a Drago behind some of your gear checking tagging ice, and you would just try and give the runner tags. And eventually, if they didn't handle the Drago immediately, you would eventually play Market Forces and Self-Growth Program to just bounce them back until you could draw your booms, and then you would flatline them. What often happened is that the runner could deal with your Drago, often by including cards like Pinhole Threading and No Free Lunch to avoid your tag punishment. And so you would then have to either continue to advance the Drago if they handled it indirectly, or you would have to recur the Drago in some fashion. So that's why Archive Memories was pitched as being on the ban list in the last ban list update. However, it turns out that you can use cards like Restore and Spin Doctor to get back enough Dragos. We also saw at the Circuit Breaker Invitational, some people were even running Simulation Reset so they could do even more recursion. But you didn't need to recur, like you would still have between your Spin Doctors and Restores, you could have a lot of copies of Drago in your deck. The thing was, this deck couldn't really score, and it often took a very long time to score to land the boom. So in theory, right, the runner should have windows to go and exploit it. But there was a couple of things. One, because you were Reality Plus, you could just advance the Drago for free every turn. You would basically spend 2 clicks, give the runner a tag, and then you'd have 1 click to do something else. And then the runner could click for 2 credits, clear the tag, and then had 1 click to do something. And so in theory, you kind of are having this one click kind of standstill game. In practice, that was slightly favored for the Reality Plus deck. And you could say, oh, but all these agendas are going to build up in HQ, and if the runner just trashes the booms, it'll be fine. But the problem was Bologna is basically impossible to steal if you get stuck in this credit fight. And it was very easy for an unadvanced card to be a Drago, which gets advanced, give the runner tag, makes the corp their 2 credits back, and then they have a 6 credit swing of landing the market forces and getting back 3 credits. And then if the runner tries to go and interact, they have the hard-hitting news to back it up. And so the runner couldn't steal the Bolognas most of the time, and then they often couldn't steal the degree mill because they would have to install cards, and they only have 1 click a turn, which has to be some way of keeping up with the econ threat behind the Drago. And so there was a lot of ways proposed, and a lot of ways the standard Banlist team talked about banning Drago. And they talk about, they looked at a bunch of different things, like the Reality Plus Prison deck is the main target they were looking at. And there were other decks that they thought were more healthy, so the Urban Renewal Op list. I'm not going to go into this list extensively, but the combo is basically you use Urban Renewal. When it trashes, you then search for Drago because it's a 0 cost, and you still have all 3 of your clicks left, so you can advance, play end of the line, and you'll have done 8 damage. And that would seem to be like a pretty cool deck and one they wanted to support, because ultimately that deck was actually very, very fair. Both players had options to play, and it was, I think, a very cool deck. And so they talk about one idea was banning Reality Plus. Now, what they say here is that Asmari EdTech and was just basically good enough at doing that plan. I am pretty skeptical of that claim, but they have internal testing data. I think it's sort of this is where I think philosophically you have to ask what the goal of the Netrunner competitive scene is. And I think SBT made a really reasonable decision, which is this deck is miserable. Let's make sure there's no chance this deck remains. And I think to me, the question I'm more interested in is what is the closest we can get to keeping this interesting card in the format while tuning out its most frustrating matchup. And so the thing to me that I felt like the difference is against something like Asmari, they're not going to be making credits off of advancing the Drago, so they have to spend actual resources. Now, yes, in theory, they can make those resources back, but runners actually have some pretty varied econ options, and even just clicking for credits becomes a winnable race, because if the corp is draining themselves 2 credits to then give you a tag, and then clicks back for a credit, as the runner, you can basically stay even with that race forever, and eventually the corp will flood out and lose their ability to advance the game state. Which isn't true of Reality Plus, where Reality Plus is going up +1 credit rather than Asmari, which would be going -1 credit every turn. Now, maybe that's not enough, and actually the deck would still be really good, and then my ban list would be really bad. It would be a huge failure. And so I think it's pretty reasonable to say, yeah, banning Reality Plus is not guaranteed to be enough, so let's look at something else. They also said they looked at Degree Mill. I don't know if this was at the same time or reverse with Reality Plus. And they also mentioned self-growth program with a swatch to retribution. And they say basically none of this stuff really worked. And it's like, yeah, at a certain point you have to ask yourself, is it worth banning 3-4 cards just to save Drago for an out-of-faction combo deck? And the answer is probably no. And so I think that's why they came to this conclusion. I'm very curious about what the world looks like where we do ban Reality Plus and say, let's see if runners can deal with it. I think it's very hard, as someone who just came from doing the playtesting for Borealis side. It's really hard to know what the power level of cards are, and if they're with small testing teams, it's basically impossible to know what the meta is going to look like. And I don't think SBT is immune from that. They certainly have a little more, they get some benefits that playtesting doesn't. But, within a day of this ban list being street legal, there's going to be more games played, probably by an order of magnitude at least. And so it's really tricky. And it's interesting, there's a lot of ways you could think about this. You could say, hey, the meta was solved previously, and we just want to make sure that meta never comes back. And I think that's basically what SBT did pretty reasonably. You could say, hey, maybe the meta wasn't solved, and knocking down the top deck by 10%, that's actually enough to lead to a new boom of exploration. And that's sort of what I would probably do if I was in charge of Netrunner, but, I think there's good reasons to not have me in charge of Netrunner. So Drago is gone. I don't think, it's a card I would love to see come back someday, but I suspect it is yet another champ card that's stuck on the list forever. Next up, they talk about endurance, which I think makes the most sense to talk about. This is actually, you'll note, these are Leech Road's decks. These are from the UK Nats, and they basically got played straight up at the Circuit Breaker Invitational, which is on the Null Signal Games channel, and you can hear some familiar voices casting it. And this list basically says, well, if the thing I have to beat is Reality Plus, I'm going to play 3 Pinhole Threadings and 2 Deuces Wilds, or sometimes some people played 2 No Free Lunches. They were pretty interchangeable. And then 2 copies of Endurance. And basically you play the Pinhole Threadings and Deuces / No Free Lunches to deal with the Reality Plus matchup. Basically, you would just drag them out through a very slow game where you would beat their ice when you could, Pinhole when you couldn't, Deuces or No Free Lunch to clear, tags on tempo, and eventually you would just exhaust their Dragos because you couldn't afford to score. And then against literally every other deck in the field, you had Endurance plus Hippo, which was a great way of invalidating any ice-based strategy. And so the stuff we saw was some people would do Sports Metal, some people would do Hard Prison Ag Infusion, and some people do Reality Plus. And this Hoshiko list was able to handle all 3 of them. At least with a pretty high reliability. And so Endurance is the candidate that SBT went after, and I think it's a very reasonable candidate. Endurance, while making up a smaller and smaller portion of the top 8 and top 16 of large events, is undeniably the most powerful force in the meta, I think, in terms of shaping what decks look like. And so it's pretty reasonable to say that Endurance is too strong. I think it is undeniably too strong in Anarch. I think this is the thing that I'm like, I go back and forth about, especially as a hardcore Shaper player. Basically, Shaper is not going to be a faction again for another 3 to 4 months at least, until new cards come out. Because both Endurance got banned and the next deck after that got banned. So basically, Shaper's back to playing APOC. Unless someone's got some really clever stuff lined up. There are a couple of cards that I could see doing some damage, and I'll probably be streaming those because I can't stop playing Shaper. But basically what we're seeing is that Anarch is just really, really good. And I think this is the interesting thing that I should have pulled this up in advance. But this is the thing where I'm like, hey, we're banning Endurance because it's really good in Hoshiko. If we look, if we look at the 2022 World Championship, we do have a Shaper deck winning, which I think is pretty cool. And then it's Anarch, Crim, Anarch, Anarch, Crim, Anarch, Anarch, Shaper, Anarch, 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 Shaper, Crim, Shaper, Anarch, or Crim, excuse me. Then we have Anarch winning, Anarch winning, Anarch winning, Anarch winning, Shaper winning, Anarch winning. Anarch has been king of the hill, and like in 2021, Anarch was running the field. In 2020, it's a mix of Anarch and Crim again. Though I think, yeah, it's probably slightly Crim favored. And then 2018 is Anarch favored. 2019, I think, is actually a pretty healthy mix again. But I think something that is just sort of feels like to me is that what's actually the problem in the Hoshiko lists and in the Anarch card pool in general is they have so much access to unconditional money. And Endurance came along and solves one of their problems, which is that Black Orchestra and MK Ultra are really bad cards. And Endurance says, well, now you don't have to play these except in extreme circumstances. And Endurance can bridge your early game, and then you can use Hippo to prolong that early game, and you can use Liberated Accounts, Paladin Poemu, Dirty Laundry, Moshing. Like, you just have all of this synergy that's built up. And you can't banning any one piece doesn't make any sense, because basically I would argue outside of Paladin, there's no card that's an automatic include in an Anarch deck that is very clearly better than anything else you can play. Like, Liberated Account is not a hyper efficient card, but it is really robust money that has no interaction basically from the court. You have Hippo to blow up the game. You have Mad Dash is just an incredible card right now. Stargate is still basically the only win condition on the runner side. So playing that influence free with 2 extra MU on both of your console options is just really, really powerful. And I think it also bears mentioning that Fermenter is the best econ card, I think, in the game right now, which is pretty wild. This is a card that I think a lot of people thought was fairly innocuous, didn't see a lot of play for a long time, and I think is now doing a ton of damage as an econ card for runners. Because while it is technically worse than Rozeki, in practice, getting credits twice as fast and being single use is basically as good. It's a little more influence, so it hurts more out of other factions. But every Anarch deck, I think, is going to start with 3 Fermenters, 2 Paladins, 3 Hippos, and you go from there, right? You play Paperclip, the best breaker in the game. MK Ultra and Black Orchestra are just really good for just being clickless installs, even though they're not good breakers. So what does Anarch look like, post Endurance ban? I think it's an open question. A lot of people are like, oh, we'll just play Turbine. I don't know that Turbine actually solves the problem that Anarchs have in Standard, but maybe it does. Maybe they can play aggressive early and then use Turbine and Buzzsaw and Cleaver to bridge their late game. But I think Endurance really helps solve their early game problems, and they're going to be looking to solve those same early game problems. So I wouldn't be too surprised to see stuff like Boomerang come back in, and then just Anarchs to keep bullying people with their big wallets. I don't think there's a reasonable case to be made that Endurance should stick around. But I do wonder if a different look at the ban list would instead of hit a bunch of runner econ and then try to see if that, because I think most people have agreed that even before Endurance, runners were too rich. And that's why you could have at 2021, long before Endurance ever came out, the best max deck was just a bunch of trip cards making a lot of money. And you didn't try and play anything clever. You just played all of your econ gaining events. And that was the big theory behind Max. That was even the theory behind Atom. Like, every runner side deck is just this idea that you will inevitably accrue a ton of credits. And Anarch is the best faction to do that in, which is a little bit weird for a faction that also has stuff it does really well, like trashing corpse stuff. So they're in a really strong place and will continue to be very strong after this ban list. Shaper will once again suffer for Anarch sins, but there's probably not an alternative you could do that wouldn't be an enormous shake of the whole meta that probably is bigger than the SBT was looking to do on a single ban list. Next up, let's actually jump back to corpse side. So this is maybe not the only Ag Infusion deck, but I think this is maybe the most famous Ag Infusion deck. This is going to be one of 2 Deer decks. I'm looking across 6 decks. We're only going to be talking about 3 players' publications, but as all of these decks are the work of more than just a single individual. But this was one of the Ag Infusion Prison decks, and there was various varieties of this. We saw versions. This is on Dr. Viantine Keeling and Tier, and just trying to kill the runner. There are versions that try and score. There are versions that do other types of flatlines. But the idea behind this Ag Infusion deck was you would have your Nanisivik Grid, you would put one on Archives, put one on your remote, and then put Keeling in that remote. And the runner would have to pay an enormous cost to get in. And they would actually have to have 2 pinholes in hand to disrupt any of your Nanisivik grids, because you would just make sure to have a unres piece of ice on your servers that didn't have Nanisivik grids. On your servers that did have Nanisivik grids, you could just fire the Nanisivik grid when they came into pinhole, and then on your other 2 servers, you could boop them into the servers with the Nanisivik grid, and the runner basically would have no recourse. So they would have to play a pinhole threading, bait out 1 boop, then play the second pinhole threading and land it, and then go and make an exploitation of the board state, which is really, that's a huge ask for the runner. I think, this one, they even mentioned in the article, we looked at errata because we think Nanisivik Grid's an interesting card, but just is missing the text that says something like remote only or unique. I suspect actually remote only is the only. I actually suspect that unique is not quite enough. But they mentioned that basically they don't want to do a rotter for that. It's not appropriate for the game. And it's just easier to ban the card. And not just easier, but better for the player base, which, again, something I maybe personally disagree with, but I think ultimately they have a good argument for. Yeah, I don't particularly mind this one. I think we'll still see some Prison Ag Infusion decks. The Loki Ag Infusion deck from Worlds last year is still totally legal, and maybe it gets even stronger with Keeling, but I'll leave that for better players than me, more prison-y players than me to figure out. And finally, we have World Tree Woo. This is a deck that saw 0 competitive results. Like, you could argue that this deck also showed no competitive results. I think it did quite well at Fight Night. I guess World Tree Woo did as well. And the Ag Infusion decks were all basically a game out of making the cut. Woo actually didn't even have that kind of damage. Woo was a sub 50% runner at the Circuit Breaker Invitational. I don't think anyone's put up major results with it, but it is a deck that basically they think, well, if you take out Reality Plus, that was the deck that was keeping this Woo deck down. This Woo deck typically ran 1, maybe 2 World Trees, which is the main engine of the deck, and then would play between 65 and 80 cards, somewhere in that range. And then it would just burn through the deck, finding the right tool, turning Harbingers into the program of the moment, turning Makeflies into the program of the moment, turning single-use resources into other resources, so stuff like Telework Contract and Daily Casts would interconvert with each other. They would find Citadel Sanctuaries if you need to survive. You could have Cyberdelia, so you'd make money-breaking ice, and when Cyberdelia comes out for free, it's quite good. You also had Endurance powering your accesses. And basically SBT says, yeah, this is pretty unhealthy if the runner doesn't have to worry about their rig getting bounced on them. You know, hard-hitting news isn't really a plausible threat against this deck because they will go in tutor misdirection and clear their tags. And so there's lots of ways you could approach banning this, but I think Cabanessa Woo is a pretty clean ban just to make sure, similar to how you said, we don't want to see Drago coming back at all. We don't like that style of deck. We don't like the style of runner deck that is able to establish a lock with World Tree by turn 5 or 6, but doesn't win the game for many, many, many more turns. And probably the runner winning consistently on turn 5 or 6 is just not something that's viable or healthy for the game. And so that just needs to get cut down. So I'm not really going to talk about the cards in this list in particular. There's a lot of them. They are all good for certain situations. And this deck is gone. I think people will explore putting this style of shell in Ayla because you can maybe tutor your World Trees a bit more consistently. But instead of having 65 cards, you can have 45 cards, which actually means you're going to run out of gas way, way faster. Much faster than you think you will, having played a little bit of World Tree Woo. But it's interesting because I think World Tree still has a high ceiling, but it's going to be much less reliable, which probably means we'll see it less at top tables. But it's definitely one of those cards that I wouldn't be surprised to see someone make work either immediately or sometime in the future. So that's the ban list. You know, I don't know what I would do different. You know, it's something like, yeah, maybe I would look at banning 2 Anarch Econ cards, maybe Paladin and Fermenter, banning daily casts, and then seeing what that would look like, right? That would maybe be my different runner bans. Probably, I'm not particularly fond of Woo. I would not mind cutting that ban just to kill this deck as well. And looking at like, oh, could we ban Reality Plus and Degree Mill? Does that do enough to stop that archetype? Maybe it doesn't, right? And to be honest, that requires a ton of playtesting resources. It requires organizational buy-in because you're banning way more cards. Instead of having a 4-card ban list, you're having like a 6 to 10 card ban list. And maybe you're going to end up in a meta that looks exactly the same and everyone just gets mad at you and you have to reverse course and go to this ban list, which I think is very effectively going to move us into a new meta. So speaking of that new meta, what do we think it's going to look like? I don't have a strong answer for you. I think what I would do is I would go back to Worlds 2021 and I would start looking at what is strong here. We've got PD, which I think actually is really suffering post some ban list changes, in particular Sandbox going, which I have to imagine was legal in this. Yeah. Sandbox is gone, Advanced Assembly Lines is gone, so the deck is just way weaker than it was. Gagarin is gone, but maybe you can do something kind of similar out of Ob. I don't know exactly what Rusty Rider was doing, but we did see some Asmari lists without Drago still put up results. It actually won UK Nats, even though people don't think it was the best deck there. It could probably be tweaked and optimized. The other thing I'm going to mention is Sports Metal. This is Cahuita brought this to American Continentals last year, and this list is still completely legal. It's, Sports Metal didn't get a ton from Parhelion, but this deck is pretty happy to see Endurance gone. I suspect you could actually go slightly ice heavier. You could look at something that's sort of like Sokka's Snacks list. And the fact that you don't have to deal with Endurance means that you probably don't have to run next activation commands, but you can run other cards that might be really good. And honestly, Ice might even be a reasonable solution because now you're gear checking the runner in addition to playing a fast advanced strategy, which is like, I think, a pretty strong fork to offer yourself. So you've got some real options in Sports Metal. And I should say the other deck I'm expecting to see a ton of, even though people don't like often Tag Me and are worried about certain matchups, if NBN with Market Forces is not a part of the meta, I think I'm expecting tons of Tag Me Zaya. I'm actually almost a little surprised this didn't get tagged in the ban list, because immediately on that ban list being released, everyone's like, oh yeah, Tag Me Zaya is going to be just a deck to beat. And it is super hard to beat without the correct tech. The idea behind this list is you can have Obelisk, and once you're on 2 or 3 tags, you're boom proof unless the corp does some real shenanigans here. And usually those are over multiple turns. So the goal is you take a bunch of tags. Doesn't have to be actually that many. It can be 6, it can be 8. You're not usually looking to dig R&D for 20 credits. You're really just going to be using stuff like rogue trading and what are the other ones? Credit kiting and hot pursuit. Just get a modest number of tags and then lock R&D, and you'll get paid all those credits back if you don't win the game. And you can just play really aggressive standard criminal stuff and have lots of threats. You might even explore doing this in Anarch instead, because you'll note Obelisk, Counter Surveillance are both in Anarch, and you also have God of War to go and get even more tags passively. So even though you'd have to normally import the credit kitings and the hot pursuits and the rogue tradings, you have in-faction ways of generating tags as well. So, with NBN taking a huge hit of basically their only tag delivery vehicle now being Public Trail and hard-hitting news, you're just going to see a way less Market Forces. You're going to see way less Self-Growth Program, and Counter Surveillance Criminal and Anarch, archetype usually called Tag Me, is going to be very excited about that. And I'm a little bit worried about what that's going to do to the meta. As someone who likes to play HB, HB usually has a 20% win rate against a counter surveillance deck, because it's just very easy for them to guarantee the counter surveillance runs. And if you double border control R&D or something to stop it, well, then you can't really protect your remote, because you need to also get that going. But we'll see. People have proclaimed that it's the meta of Tag Me many times, and very rarely has it actually manifested. So we will have to see. I hope you all enjoyed my ramblings, incoherent or not. I want to say once again, huge thank you to the SBT. This is not an easy job. It is very easy for me to quarterback this one. I think honestly, this meta that's created, the 2303 meta, is going to be better than the previous meta. So it just makes sense. And hopefully y'all will enjoy it. And I certainly think I will. And I will be back every Wednesday, hopefully, streaming Netrunner and making videos about decks. So thank you all for tuning in. Please remember to like and subscribe if you've stuck it out this long. And yeah, I think that's it. So thank you.